Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this webinar to discuss an extremely important issue, K-12 funding in the state of Washington. My name is Amy Anderson. I'm the Government Affairs Director for Education and Workforce Training for the Association of Washington Business. The format for today's webinar will be as follows. Our guests will provide background information and thoughts on the topic. At any time, you may send your questions in, and we'll address these questions at the end. Joining us today is Senator Andy Billig from the 3rd Legislative District. Senator Billig is the Deputy Minority Leader. Thank you, Senator Billig, for being with us today. To start off, could you give us an overview of education funding as you see it today in the legislature?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, Amy, for the opportunity to be here. And obviously, K-12 education is the issue for this session. We're under a court order to comply with our constitutional and, I believe, moral obligation to fully fund basic education. And there's a number of plans that are out there. So there's a Democratic plan that came out of the Education Funding Task Force. And then there's a Republican Senate plan that was proposed and has gone through a couple of variations. So we've got the plans out there. I'll just touch on some of the highlights of the Democratic plan, and then would love to take questions and just have a dialogue if that's okay.
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
So the Democratic plan, which is a House and Senate Democratic plan from the four Democratic members of the Education Funding Task Force, really built on the 8 months of work of the Education Funding Task Force and the consultant that we hired to come up with information related to teacher salaries and also to analyze how districts were using their levy funds in their individual districts. And so our plan invests in student success, particularly helping low-income students with LAP funds, helping English language learning, special education, which is underfunded, and CTE, which is the career and technical education. We also, and all of the plans, focus on raising teacher salaries, which is one of the keys. The state has to take over the responsibility for basic education teacher salaries, which is one of the real foundations of the McCleary decision. One of the things that I think is important and that our plan does is to really focus on local control so that we leave the ability for levies at a fairly significant level so that local voters can decide if they want to invest more in their schools for non-basic ed. And it's very important that we put up some sideboards so that we keep the state's responsibility for funding basic ed. But if there are additional things, like in Spokane, the school district pays for the SATs for every student. A local district should be able to do that if the local voters want to support that, or if they want to augment their music or arts program or their sports programs, they should be able to do that. Accountability is very important in our plan, making sure that we fund the reforms that we've put in place in the past, like the teacher principal evaluation program. We also really need to have accountability on those local funds to make sure they're not being spent on basic ed. And the last thing on accountability, and I think there's general consensus across the board on this, is that we help schools that are having trouble. And so these RAD districts, required action districts, have been successful, particularly my district in Spokane. We've got a great success story. I think now we've got several plans out. It's time to negotiate, to really get in a room and try to hammer out the details. And I think I remain optimistic that we're going to be able to find common ground, that we're going to be able to deliver for the students of Washington. There's a lot in common. Both the Republican and Democratic plan, both cost about $7 billion. So we've got, close to agreement on what the cost is. They both require new money. Both plans are not fully funded in the policy bill and are going to need additional work, either through cuts to the budget or new revenue or some combination of the two. So there's a lot of commonalities there. And the last thing I just want to mention, and if anybody wants to, we can get into it more, is that while the McCleary decision focuses particularly on K-12, I think it's important to remember that early learning and higher ed are also important parts of the educational spectrum. And if we do something for K-12, but we do it at the expense of early learning or higher ed, we actually haven't helped students to be successful. And early learning in particular is something that I'm passionate about because I think it's the best investment we can make. It's the best thing for those kids. It's also the best thing for the taxpayer dollars because we get the best return on investment. And I hope that any plan that we come up with also invests heavily in early learning. Even though legally not required by the Supreme Court decision, if we're trying to get success, K-12 success, we need to invest in that area as well. So I'll pause there and would love to take any questions you have or anybody that's out there.
Thank you for bringing up early learning as well. It is an extremely important aspect of our education system. The $7 billion that this is going to cost. In the Democrats' plan, can you explain how we might be looking at funding that?
Yeah. So in both the Republican and Democratic plan, there are these funding holes where it's not completely outlined of how to pay for it. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, people a lot of times just talk about the money, and a lot of times I'll be out over the interim I was out, and people would be like, full funding of education, just do it. And the problem is, until very recently, there was no it. The last two biennia where we invested heavily in K-12 education, we had an outline of what we were investing in. We had already outlined that we needed to do class size reduction, we needed to increase student transportation funding, the MSOC, which is the materials and supplies funds. So it was just coming up with the money to fund those things. What we have to do this time is to come up with what is that last piece in terms of taking over compensation for basic ed, and how do you do that? And there's a million little pieces. So it's very complicated policy. So these bills focus first on the policy, and then secondly, we've got to come up with the funding. And I think which funding is it going to be? I think it's got to be funding that we can get the votes for. It's got to be something that we negotiate to say, yes, we can get there on a carbon tax or on a capital gains tax or on a sales tax on the internet. Whatever those pieces are, a combination of those pieces, or maybe it's cut somewhere else. And again, the Republican plan has about $2.5 billion that's not funded. Same thing, we've got to get together and negotiate that. And I think there's a variety, I mentioned a couple of them, I think there's a variety of sources that we could use. None of them are great, nobody wants to raise taxes, but our taxes at a per capita basis, in terms of a percentage of personal income, are at fairly historic lows. So I think there should be some capacity to do that. And I think there's a will of the voters to invest in education. So if we come up with a thoughtful plan that raises revenue, that goes to helping kids, I think we'll have the support for that. And I think we can get the bipartisan support for that.
So you mentioned class sizes,
Yes.
And talking about that. The one big difference between the Democrats' plan and the Republicans' plan is that the Republicans repeal Initiative 1351, a reduction in class sizes across the board.
Yeah.
You have already put in place, the legislature, class size reductions in K through 3, and that's taking place across the state now. Studies have shown that it's more the quality of the teacher than the quantity of the student in grades 4 through 12 that makes a difference to our kids' education. Is there room to negotiate for Initiative 1351 and making changes there?
So a couple of things. One, I would say that the data, that I agree partially with what you said. There is data to show that grades 4 through 12, smaller class size matter. They just don't matter as much as K through 3, and that's why we focused on K through 3. The Democratic plan actually does repeal the 4 through 12 class size. So the pieces of 1351 that we retain in, so we do what we call a partial repeal of 1351. And what we've retained are the investments, the additional investments in school counselors, family engagement coordinators, those things that help kids that are struggling to be successful. And so there's actually, on the part you talked about, the class size for the larger grades, there is already agreement on that. So I don't think that that's going to be a problem to nail that down and align it specifically. So
going back to you're talking about both plans are putting in place funding for special populations or specific populations. Career and tech education was a big piece of that. Mm-hmm. That's something that our businesses talk about on a regular basis. We have a high demand in the workforce for those skills that kids will learn in career and technical education classes. Yeah. How does the plan address that piece of it?
Yeah, well, the good thing about career technical education, and there are probably 5 or 6 kind of key areas where we have broad agreement, and that's why I remain hopeful that we're going to reach some kind of a compromise, and CTE is one of them. But the key thing is that we actually put more money into the system, so that we're actually putting more money into CTE and not saying, we're going to take money from over here, we're going to take the money that you were spending on local programs and now require you to spend it on CTE. And I think that's one of the differences in the two plans, is the Democratic plan is actually putting significant new resources back into the schools and saying you can spend it on CTE and special ed and these other things, versus just sort of moving the shells around and saying, look, we're going to add just a little bit of money, but we're going to tell you different ways that you need to spend it. That's one of my criticisms with the Republican plan, is that it doesn't actually put that much more money in. Even though they have $7 billion, just like the Democratic plan has $7 billion, they take most of that $7 billion and buy down people's property taxes. Great thing. I love my property taxes to go down. But we're trying to come up with an education funding plan, and we need to invest that money into kids. And quite frankly, that when you look at the taxes that would come down in the Republican plan, like in Spokane, it's essentially taxes the voters have voted on, saying we want these taxes to be investing in schools. And so while people may welcome a little bit of a tax decrease, I think they've shown that they just assume have those taxes if it's going to go to funding their schools. And we've got great schools in Spokane. I think people are pretty happy with that. So what I want to make sure is that we're actually investing in CTE and some of these other things, and not just real money, not just moving money around from some other place.
So you talked about accountability quite a bit, and both plans do have aspects of that, as well as teacher and principal evaluations. Speak to the pieces in your plan that prepare our teachers and also provide for them some professional development opportunities.
Yeah, one of the key pieces of our plan I didn't mention earlier is to have professional development days funded by the state. And I think it's crucial. I mean, I run a business. My other job is to run the Spokane Indians baseball team. I've done that for 22 years. And whether it's with our players or with our management staff, and I'm sure most of your members, is that if you've got professionals, you're probably investing in their development. And if not, you probably should be. And so it's really important that we provide the time and the training so that new teachers particularly can get better, that teachers that have been there a while can have help to recognize where they need to get better or where they're doing really well, and then provide those resources for them to get better, whether it's through a teacher mentor or through a professional training day. And so I think that's something that's really a key feature of our plan, and I want to make sure that happens, because if we just expect teachers to go in the classroom and say, hey, have at it and good luck, I think that that's a concern. And so these mentoring programs and professional development are crucial.
So building on that a little bit, Spokane has done a phenomenal job of integrating business and education. You have business really keyed into what the needs are. Is that something under professional development that could be expanded upon, allowing teachers to have business-based, work-based experiences as their professional development so that they can have a practical application of that curriculum that they're teaching?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. One of the things one of my philosophies on the professional development is that we provide the professional development days. We say these days actually have to happen. The teachers actually have to be there. The principals actually have to be there. But then we leave it up to the local districts to say, hey, for our districts, for our teacher, for this particular teacher, here's what's going to work best. And so if a particular district says, hey, this is something that would work well, or for a particular department or a particular school, here's what would work well, then they'll have the flexibility to do that. And I think that's important, one, because that could help a particular teacher do well, could energize a teacher, but also we're a system of local control. So we've got 295 school districts, and I think there are some people that say, hey, we should not have that. We should have it all wrapped up, and Olympia should tell everybody exactly what to do on everything. That's not the system we have, and as long as we have the local system, I think we should let them do it. And professional development's a perfect example, because as you said, that's an idea you had that may be great in a particular case, and a district should be able to do that if they want to.
So one of the concerns that we hear about is, you talk about accountability on the funding side of it. How are we're putting a lot more money into the school districts. How will the state know that those funds are being used for basic education? How are we kind of making sure that we don't get into this McCleary issue again?
That's a great point, and something we've talked about a lot. And I think in our plan, what we talk about is working with the business managers to come up with the plan to say, how do we account for it differently? One of the things we learned in the Education Funding Task Force this interim is that there were actually some prohibitions in state law that prevented school districts from actually showing. We wanted to show when money comes in. So we would say, from your state money versus your local money, show us exactly what you spent it on. They actually had to put the money by law, had to put the money all in one account. So they had to mix the money. And they weren't even allowed to create a spend out of two different accounts. So we've created some things already, some direction, and I think part of any plan that we would have is some very clear guidelines on how to account for the money, so that then an auditor can come in and say, yes, the local money was spent for extra, for enhancements, and the state money was spent for the basic ed, and there's a clear delineation. So it's partly setting up the sort of internal accounting procedures, and then it's the enforcement of it. And I think we have to do both.
Well, we want to be respectful of your time, so I want to give you an opportunity to wrap this up. Any final comments that you have?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. This is vitally important, and you talk a lot about education as a way to prepare kids to work in a business, and that is very important. That's one of the key things of our educational system. I think the other thing that we sometimes get lost on is that we're also trying to prepare citizens, and when you think about and critical thinkers. And so, yeah, do we want somebody that knows how to operate this machine or knows how to do this particular accounting skill or whatever it is? Yes, but we want to create critical thinkers. And I think teachers are the key to not only those specific skills, but also to create critical thinkers, to create responsible citizens, to create people that are going to be, really great leaders in the future. And so I'm optimistic because I've met so many great teachers, but we have to invest in the students, we have to invest in the professional development of those teachers, and I think we will. I think we're going to come out with a good plan. I just hope everybody's ready to come together and negotiate. We're looking forward the next week or so to get started on those negotiations, and appreciate the support of AWB to help push things along so we can make some progress.
Good. Well, we appreciate your time and your passion for this and look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us this morning.